Coming this morning to Montreal from Detroit for this symposium, for this exploration of the topographies of mass violence, and just taking in the very powerful presentations of Caroline and Julie, it's also impossible for me not to think about the way in which my journey today began in a place that was and is called Zakabijasing in Ojibwe and Okanagan in Wendat. And so this is a journey that traversed a space that has been defined by, contoured by, produced by precisely the sort of violence that we are here today to discuss. And so I hope among the many things that we might talk about, one might be the possibilities for co-liberation in places that might appear to be very different, facing very different challenges. I want to begin with maybe a very obvious, perhaps even banal observation, which is that architecture does not only offer tools to explore the topographies of mass violence, architecture also produces the landscapes that those topographies describe. And architecture can do this in its most mundane processes as well as in exceptional circumstances. But how to respond to architectural violence when it is acclaimed as an architectural achievement? To what degree can the discipline of architecture, the profession of architecture, the institutions of architecture, the spaces of architecture, to what degree can they accommodate critiques of architectural violence? Where in the discipline, where in the profession, where in the institutions of architecture to locate resistance to violence that is imminent to architecture? Where and how can architecture be decolonized? These questions became very vivid to me in the summer of 2015. They became vivid to me because two very short texts about Detroit emerged in two communities that I reside in. One community was an academic community. The other community was an activist community. These two texts had a potential relationship to each other, and that potential relationship compelled me and my allies to actualize that relationship, to bring these texts into a relationship that was only welcome on the activist side, but that intended to animate the academic side, and intended or attempted to incorporate the spaces of the university and the spaces of the museum into an activist struggle for a right to the city. One text was an announcement about an exhibition. The exhibition was entitled The Architectural Imagination, and this exhibition was to be the program for the US Pavilion in the 2016 Venice Biennale of Architecture. The biennial competition for this program, which is overseen by the US Department of State, was won by a team of two curators. One curator was, at the time, the Dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, and the other curator is the editor of a New York-based architecture journal. In the architectural imagination, the two curators proposed to commission what they called speculative architectural projects produced by what they called visionary American architects for 4 sites in Detroit. Detroit, according to the curators, is like many post-industrial cities, coping with a changed urban core that for decades has generated much thinking in urban planning. And so, as advocates of the power of architecture to construct culture and catalyze cities, curators Cynthia Davidson and Monica Ponce de Leon will commission 12 visionary American architectural practices to produce new work that demonstrates the creativity and resourcefulness of architecture to address the social and environmental issues of the 21st century. Now this proposal was made for this exhibition during a time of radical urban restructuring in Detroit. This period was initiated by the declaration of a state of financial emergency in Detroit by Michigan's governor. It was followed by the imposition of a genuine state of emergency by the replacement of Detroit's democratically elected mayor and city council by an emergency manager appointed by the governor. It was followed by the declaration of municipal bankruptcy by that emergency manager, and then by the engineering of a bankruptcy settlement that ushered in a whole set of radical urban austerity policies. These policies, which are still in the midst of unfolding, are yielding large-scale displacements of mostly working class and disadvantaged communities of color, especially the black communities that comprise over 80% of Detroit's population. And these places also very much emerge from what could be understood as an architectural imagination. These policies include a campaign to demolish tens of thousands of so-called blighted houses, and this while the need for affordable housing in Detroit remains acute. These policies include mass tax foreclosures and mass mortgage foreclosures and mass evictions of tens of thousands of mostly working class families of color from their homes. This in order to put those homes on the market and allow them to be sold mostly to investors and speculators to collect back taxes and presumably to raise property values in Detroit. These policies include the imposition of a program to shut off water to houses where people have unpaid water bills. These are houses mostly occupied by working class families of color, families who are being displaced from the neighborhoods that they built and the neighborhoods that they lived in. This because they can't afford to pay some of the highest rates for water in the United States in what is one of the most economically challenged cities in the United States. Now, as this list of the sponsors of the U.S. Pavilion reveals, much of the capital that was going to go into funding the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture was going to come from corporations that directly would benefit from the displacement of Detroit's working class communities of color. Westin, for example, is a luxury hotel chain. Aperol is a luxury liquor. Shinola is a Detroit-branded luxury fashion company. Dassault Systems makes 3D software that architects and designers use to make luxury architecture. The Deschler Group, GTM, and GS3 are subsidiaries of a single corporate conglomerate that supplies the parts and logistics that manufacturers use to make automobiles, luxury automobiles, and otherwise. And this I could go on, but I think you get the point, which is that this list of sponsors is a kind of preliminary indication of how the U.S. Pavilion in the Venice Biennale was participating in and advancing a kind of alignment of cultural attention on the one hand and economic investment on the other hand. Investment that was transforming Detroit into a city of mostly white, gentrifying consumers. So in the summer of 2015, when the program for the U.S. Biennale, the U.S. Pavilion at the Biennale was announced, virtually all activist groups in Detroit were working with communities in order to contest the policies that I just mentioned. One of these groups is a group I'm part of called the We the People of Detroit Community Research Collective. And we were working on the water crisis facing many of the city's communities of color. The introduction to this report was the second text that concerned me because I couldn't help reading it in relationship to the program for the architectural imagination. In the introduction to this report, two members of our collective wrote the following. Detroit community activists recognize that the water crisis and the other destabilizing policies driven by corporate and government austerity imperatives are leading to the erasure of our communities and to a reconfiguring of city land and resources to accommodate corporate objectives. To put it simply, we understand that the forces at work are genocidal. Now, in this report, which was published in the summer of 2016, we included a timeline of water shutoffs. And you can see that the precise moment when the program for the US Pavilion was announced, this is in the summer of 2015, this was a moment when the number of water shutoffs in the city of Detroit approached 4,000 households per month. So reading the program for the architectural imagination in relationship to the introduction to mapping the water crisis, my question was not whether Detroit was a creative city as it was described in the architectural imagination, or a genocidal city as it was described in mapping the water crisis. I also didn't have a question about how Detroit could simultaneously solicit descriptions as a creative city and a genocidal city. In fact, I didn't have any questions at all. I had a problem. And my problem was how, in the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, architectural imagination was being poised to, at once, repress and advance a necropolitical condition. In other words, a condition that was lived as genocidal for many of Detroit's working class and disadvantaged communities of color, and primarily black communities. And so in the fall of 2015, a number of friends and allies and I formed a coalition, a multiracial and intergenerational coalition that we called Detroit Resists. And inspired by the Detroit-born artist Mike Kelly, who once famously said he made art to give other people his problems, we wanted to give our problem to other people. Namely, we wanted to give our problem to these people. These are the curators of the US Pavilion who, following a template that was established in the history of colonial urbanism, recruited a disadvantaged city as a site to investigate and advance the future of the architectural discipline, and enlisted the city's communities to, and these are the words of one of the curators, to receive the gift of good architecture. We wanted to give our problem to the architects who were chosen to produce those gifts. And we wanted to give our problem to the Detroit-based city officials, to the Detroit-based philanthrocapitalists, and to the Detroit-based journalists who were celebrating this erasure of the city, celebrating this erasure of urban history, and celebrating the erasure of the city's communities as the city's appearance in the Venice Biennale. Now, one of the things that the work of Mike Kelly very beautifully demonstrated was that giving other people problems is very different than giving other people gifts. When you give gifts, whether those gifts be good architecture or anything else, you solicit an exchange that confirms the status quo. But when you give people problems, you solicit conflicts that open the status quo open to change. So we expressed our problem with the architectural imagination in an open statement, and in doing that, we initiated a process by means of which we attempted to respond and to problematize each stage of the architectural imagination in the lead up to the Venice Biennale. For some of us, Detroit Resists spoke truth to power, but for others of us, and this includes me, Detroit Resists was speaking with and speaking as part of some of the communities in Detroit that have been most affected by white supremacy, most affected by patriarchy, and most affected by heteronormativity. And these were precisely the communities whose function in the architectural imagination was to receive the gift of good architecture. So responding to the curator's advocacy of the power of architecture, our open statement argued that what the project description refers to as the power of architecture might simply serve as another name for architecture's political indifference. The capacity of architecture to be of service to political regimes, no matter their ideological orientation. And so we suggested that this architectural power has been manifestly apparent in architecture's recruitment against indigenous, impoverished, marginalized, and precarious communities across the globe in the second half of the 20th century. And we also argued that the power of architecture was being emphatically demonstrated in Detroit in the wake of the city's emergency management, in the wake of the city's bankruptcy, and in the midst of the austerity urbanism that was then being enacted in the city. And we concluded that if the mass dispossession of Detroit's predominantly African-American residents by the mobilization of their homes in austerity urbanism does not exemplify the power of architecture, then we do not know what does. We attempted to leverage the different accessibilities of urban space and digital space by making a website and Facebook and Twitter accounts and making our open statement public on those places. Now, of course, access to urban space, especially very prominent urban spaces like the Venice Biennale, depends on access to wealth, access to power, access to privilege, access to many, many other resources besides. But access to digital space is structured somewhat differently. So by advancing our response and our critique to the US Pavilion on the web, we were also initiating an investigation of the ways in which digital space allows for the circulation of texts and images and claims that would be inadmissible in urban space. But we were also interested in exploring the intersections between digital space and urban space. In other words, the ways in which digital space could prompt transformations of physical space. And so we put a PDF of our open statement on our website, and we encouraged architecture students to download it, to print it, to post it in their schools, to send us photos of their postings, so we could in turn post those photos online and consolidate a community of student resistance. We were surprised and gratified and worried about the response we received. Our open statement circulated widely on Facebook and Twitter. Students posted it in their schools. It was published and praised in Detroit's alternative press. And the architectural press began to reach out to Detroit Resists for interviews. In the following months, and these were the months in the lead up to the Biennale in the summer of 2016, we continued to respond to the curator's efforts to advertise the US Pavilion. So when a lecture series called Detroit 101 was announced at the Princeton University School of Architecture, and this was where the former dean of the University of Michigan School of Architecture moved in January 2016, we produced a reading list that we called Detroit 102. And this was a critique of the creative class narrative of urban change. That was really what Detroit 101 was oriented around. When the website of the architectural imagination used a portion of Diego Rivera's famous mural, Detroit Industry, we critiqued their presentation of that mural. This is what you see of that mural on their website. And what you see is a scene of black bodies, brown bodies, and white bodies peacefully collaborating on the assembly line at Henry Ford's Rouge River plant. With surgical precision, or you could also say architectural precision, the website crops out the rest of Rivera's mural, which shows in very vivid detail the ways in which precisely that peaceful collaboration on Ford's assembly line depended on the violent extraction of resources, material resources and human resources, from colonized lands far, far away from Detroit and its automobile factories. For us, this cropping spoke to a parallel cropping in the curator's Biennale project. The way their project cropped out the extraction of surplus value from populations of reserve labor that produce cities structured by race-based and class-based inequalities. And these were cities very much like Detroit, that we thought the gift of good architecture could at best decorate and at worst drive into further inequalities. But in Detroit Resists, we were not only critiquing those inequalities, we were also working within them. Our critique of a project with vast funding resources was made with no funding at all. And so eventually we were faced with the problem of how to respond in Detroit to an exhibition that would be displayed at the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And our solution was to carry out from Michigan a digital occupation of the US Pavilion using augmented reality. In the summer of 2016, of course, augmented reality became very familiar to audiences around the world. And this, of course, was through Pokemon Go. But we were thinking of augmented reality very differently than the way that it was used in Pokemon Go. We understood augmented reality to offer much more than Pokemon Go offers. In essence, we understood augmented reality to offer a new possibility to advance our rights to the city. And so, in our digital occupation of an exhibition that staged itself as a gift of good architecture, we tried to stage different architecture. We tried to exhibit some of the ways in which Black communities and their activist allies in Detroit were architecting their own survival and their own emancipation. And so, at last year's Venice Biennale, if you visited the US Pavilion, you had two choices. You could enter the pavilion, which you see here. You could read the introduction to the exhibition, The Architectural Imagination, and you could explore the speculative projects authored by visionary American architects that demonstrate the power of architecture in Detroit. But you also had another possibility. You could scan a QR code that you would find on catalogs and postcards that we brought to Venice. You could download an app, and you could use that app to view our digital occupation in the US Pavilion. You're looking here at a map of our occupation, and it shows the three projects that we feature. One project was a fence built by community members to protect a woman who was threatened with eviction from her house. This fence was part of a project to produce a foreclosure-free zone in which Black homes matter and Black women's lives matter, and you can see these messages that were painted on the fence. A digital image of this fence ran through the US Pavilion. A second project is a protest against water shutoffs that was carried out by an activist group called the Detroit Light Brigade. A digital image of a sign from that protest was visible in the US Pavilion. And a third project was a water tower that was painted by an activist collective to protest water shutoffs and to remember that water was and still can be a resource held in common. We digitally placed a full-size 3D model of the water tower in the courtyard of the US Pavilion. And we left a number of digital tags throughout the US Pavilion to point out that the space of the pavilion was a contested space, very much like the space of Detroit itself. And so, while the US Pavilion appropriated Detroit as essentially a blank canvas on which the discipline of architecture could explore and advance its futures, we appropriated their appropriation. And we did this to produce a platform to uplift the architecture of Detroit's Black communities and movement-based activism. I don't have time right now to fully continue the story from here, which included things like the following. Responding to the curator's argument that they worked with what they called an advisory board of community activists by pointing out that precisely who and what they called community activists were actually community development corporations, conservancies and business groups that were explicitly anti-activist, that prevented activists from protesting and demonstrating on so-called public space for water rights, and for the rights of tenants. When the curators of the pavilion advertised a discussion called Architecture and Change through a poster, we annotated that poster by producing another poster, which you see here, in which we pointed out how the word change is a generic, depoliticized term that displaces historically and politically oriented understandings of transformation over time. Perhaps most importantly, we pointed out that this discussion was essentially faculty from 4 US schools of architecture talking about the work of other faculty at the same 4 schools of architecture, funded by the same 4 schools of architecture. We placed this poster again online, and we encouraged students to post it in the hallways and studios of their schools, which they did do. I want to conclude with the journey of the exhibition, which began at the Venice Biennale, which is now being shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, and which will eventually end at the Architecture and Design Museum in Los Angeles. I want to suggest that the spatial journey of the exhibition, a journey from Venice through Detroit to Los Angeles, perhaps inadvertently represents a kind of conceptual diagram of the architecture that it exhibits. Architecture that's produced in an institutional context for an institutional context, but an architecture that seeks social legitimation by detouring through a necropolitical city whose violence this architecture normalizes. To represent this diagram, which is one of the things that Detroit Resists attempted, is to open up the possibility for architecture to understand and imagine itself otherwise. And in particular, to imagine itself in solidarity with and in relationship to communities that are architecting their own survival and their own liberation. Whether and how architecture can decolonize itself within the institutions that produce and reproduce it, of course, remains an open question. And so I'm very thankful to have had this opportunity to discuss this question in this institution. I want to end here, and I hope open, if I may, the floor for questions and discussion. Thank you.